Chapter 7, How to Hero Every Day. The Wilson family's RV should have been filled with morning sounds when Tumble made it back home. The coffee pot gurgling in the kitchen area, the tiny shower hissing, and maybe Tumble's dad singing one of his jingles while he washed his hair. Right now he was writing one for a company that made coconut shampoo. They'd sent so many free samples that the family had been using it to clean everything, from their socks to the RV's tires. Tumble set her first aid kit on the foot of her sofa bed and flopped down on top of her fuzzy blue blanket. Then she closed her eyes and sniffed the air. The RV smelled exactly right, like a sunscreen factory had exploded all over the place. But it wasn't right. Not even when Tumble tried to hum the latest version of the jingle to herself. The Wilsons had arrived at their new house the day before. The trip across the country had been made longer by their infallible GPS failing to recognize Murky Branch's existence. Who could blame it, though? According to the town sign, 342 people lived here. How was Tumble supposed to be a hero in a place that was almost not a place at all? Of course, that was exactly what her parents were counting on. "Uh-oh," the GPS had said over and over in its determined, friendly voice. "It looks as though you have gone off the map." Tumble thought it was an omen. Her parents thought it was quaint. They thought the house was quaint, too, and the town welcome sign, and even their elderly landlord, Mr. Ralph Patty, who had been waiting on their new front porch to hand over the keys. He'd wanted to apologize in person for the fact the house had no curtains. Apparently, his bonkers dog had destroyed them, along with every last doily and dust ruffle in the place. When Mr. Patty left to live with family in Orlando, the Wilsons had spent the whole afternoon unloading the RV and moving in. Tumble had been given her own bedroom for the first time in her life, and her parents had made a big deal about how exciting it was to have so much space to spread out in. They kept pointing out that Tumble's room had a view of the woods, and that she could decorate it herself. "Posters of Maximal Star everywhere if you want," her mother had offered. Considering her mother's feelings about Maximal Star, it was proof that she knew just how thoroughly she had ruined Tumble's life. But Tumble had smiled. She had nodded. At the end of the day, she had gone to her new room with its new view, and she even had let her parents tuck her in like they had when she was little. Only she couldn't sleep in the strange house, in the giant room with its thin quilt and its springy, shrieky bed. After growing up in RVs, all of the extra space felt echoing and empty. Her parents, sleeping down the hall, must have been snoring softly as usual, but Tumble couldn't hear them. Sneaking out to sleep in the RV had seemed like the obvious solution. Her sofa bed was snug, and her fuzzy blanket was soft, but without her parents and their noisy morning routine, it wasn't quite home. Tumble swallowed down something suspiciously lump-like in her throat. She reminded herself that Maximal Star wouldn't get all weepy over the fact that he had to sleep in a different bed. "Geez Louise," she thought in her sternest mental voice. "Get a grip." She racked her brain for a quote and found one. "Staying upbeat will vanquish defeat." That was from the author's note in How to Hero Every Day. Tumble sighed. "Thanks, Maximal," she whispered to the empty RV. Her parents had taken her life and had given it a good hard shake, but that didn't mean Tumble was going to fall to pieces. Heroing was an everyday business after all, and despite all odds, Tumble had found someone who needed her on her very first day in Murky Branch. Blue Montgomery. He was the solution to her problem. After her last rescue had ended, dramatically, Tumble's parents had decided she needed stability, peacefulness. A town so small it would surely bore the heroism right out of her. They wouldn't be happy to know that they had moved her right next door to a strange screaming boy who thought he was honest to goodness cursed. Tumble was feeling pretty lucky for the first time in ages. She took a deep breath, held it, and started to count seconds. This was her current self-improvement exercise, and she made a point of doing it every morning. One day she might see someone drowning, she figured, and if she could hold her breath for 2 straight minutes, she would absolutely for sure be able to save them. Probably. It might take years, but according to Maximal Star, you had to prepare for these situations well in advance. 65, 66, 67. Tumble's lungs felt like someone was trying to empty them with a vacuum hose, so she finally gave up and took another breath. 67 seconds was pretty good. It was 2 more seconds than yesterday, 20 more seconds than 2 weeks ago, and over halfway to her goal. 67 seconds made her feel confident enough to head into the house. The RV was already getting uncomfortably hot. The sofa bed creaked when Tumble stood, and it went papa papa clang clong when she folded it up and slammed it into place. Because she hadn't made the bed first, her blanket sprouted from the edges. She thought about taking the blanket with her into the air-conditioned house where she would be sleeping that night. Definitely, she would be sleeping there, because she wasn't a baby, for goodness sake. Of course, she could also wait and come back for the blanket later, if she got cold. She poked it down into the cracks and covered the sofa with its puffy white cushions. If her dad was where he was supposed to be, in the RV, drying his wet hair with a towel, he would say, "Hey, look at that! Instant living room!" And Tumble would roll her eyes because, honestly, her dad needed some new jokes. And her mother would peer blearily at them both and grunt over her cup of coffee. And Tumble shook her head at herself. She had found someone to help. That was what mattered. She crossed the yard, noticing that it was more weeds than grass, really, and who was going to take care of that? Her mother knew a lot about engines and suspensions and mechanical stuff, and her dad knew all about coconut shampoo and iambic pentameter. Tumble didn't think either of them knew the first thing about growing a lawn. That's the kind of problem you should consider before moving into a house. And who was going to keep those shiny green bushes at the corner of the house alive? Were they roses? Tumble didn't know what rose bushes looked like if there were no flowers. She hopped up the 2 steps onto the porch and noticed a hummingbird feeder hanging from the rafters. It was empty. Who was going to figure out what to feed the hummingbirds? The whole situation was frustrating. Tumble's parents had made this horrible mistake, and she knew it was a little bit her fault for almost dying during her last rescue. But there was nothing else she could have done. Her arch-enemy Susan had been shoving that 3rd grader around at the top of the off-limits old bleachers, and Tumble had intervened just in time. And the 3rd grader hadn't broken her silly head open, and it all would have been totally and completely excellent if the bleacher Tumble had chosen to stand on hadn't been rotten. She pushed away the memory of hanging from the crumbling boards, all of that empty space underneath her. Heroes take risks, not days off. The screen door squealed as she opened it. "I'm still on duty," Tumble said to herself as she stepped inside, "even when I'm off the map." Chapter 8, 12 X's. Mr. Patty's house had swallowed